During a family dinner with my parents, I received a text from an unfamiliar number. Get up and leave now. Don't say anything to your parents. I chose to obey the message. And that's how I found out the truth. The very next day, the police were knocking on their front door. But let me rewind 3 hours earlier, to when everything still felt like a normal Sunday evening in our split-level ranch house on Oakwood Drive. The dining room smelled like Mom's famous herb-crusted chicken and the vanilla candles she'd been lighting for family dinners since I was in middle school. The familiar scent of rosemary and thyme should have been comforting, but tonight it felt different somehow, heavier, like the air before a thunderstorm. Dad was asking about my job at Morrison Marketing downtown, nodding along as I told him about landing the Patterson Electronics account. Mom kept checking her phone, setting it face down next to her water glass with trembling fingers every time it buzzed. The warm amber light from Grandma's old crystal chandelier cast shadows that seemed to dance more restlessly than usual, and I found myself watching Dad's eyes as they kept darting to the antique grandfather clock in the corner, the one that had been chiming every 15 minutes since before I was born. What struck me most was how clean everything looked. Too clean. The family photos that usually cluttered the mantelpiece had been taken down, leaving pale rectangles on the floral wallpaper where they'd hung for years. Mom's collection of ceramic salt and pepper shakers that normally covered every surface in the kitchen had vanished. Even Dad's leather recliner looked stripped bare without the usual stack of Field and Stream magazines on the side table. 3 large black duffel bags sat lined up by the staircase like soldiers at attention, zipped shut and ready for a trip nobody had mentioned to me. My phone vibrated against my thigh. Unknown number. The message was short and made every nerve in my body go electric. Get up and leave now. Don't say anything to your parents. I read it twice, my heart hammering so loud I was sure they could hear it across the table. Who was this? How did they get my number? I glanced up at Mom, who was pushing pieces of chicken around her plate without eating, then at Dad, whose jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscle twitching. Everything in my gut screamed that I should trust this stranger, despite every rational thought telling me this was insane. So I invented some excuse about feeling nauseous, which wasn't entirely a lie, grabbed my purse, and headed for the front door. As I passed Dad's oak desk in the living room, I caught a glimpse of some papers scattered across the surface, but I only had time to notice a few familiar-looking lines before I was out the door and in my car. I'd never followed a stranger's orders in my life, but something about that message felt like the difference between safety and danger. I sat in my Honda Accord outside Sarah's apartment complex for 15 minutes, engine running, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The dashboard clock glowed green in the darkness, 9:47 p.m. I could see Sarah moving around in her kitchen through the second-floor window, probably making her nightly cup of chamomile tea and getting ready to watch whatever true crime documentary had caught her attention this week. Sarah Martinez had been my best friend since sophomore year of high school, which meant she'd witnessed every family crisis, every last-minute emergency, every time I dropped my own plans to rush home and fix whatever had gone wrong this time. She made space for me on her couch without asking questions, handed me a steaming mug that smelled like honey and herbs, and waited while I tried to explain something I didn't understand myself. "Maybe there's a reasonable explanation," she said. But her dark eyes told me she didn't believe it any more than I did. Sarah had watched me navigate my family's financial disasters for years, had seen me cancel study groups and date nights and birthday celebrations whenever Mom called with another crisis that somehow always required my immediate attention and my money. I found myself thinking about my 21st birthday 3 years ago, when I'd planned a small celebration at Russo's Steakhouse with my college friends. 2 hours before we were supposed to meet, Mom called sobbing because their hot water heater had burst and flooded the basement. I'd spent my birthday at Home Depot instead of toasting my legal drinking age, using my birthday money to buy industrial fans and a shop vacuum, crawling around in ankle-deep muddy water while my friends texted asking where I was and whether I was still coming. Or my high school graduation, when I'd earned valedictorian honors and a partial scholarship to State University. The night before the ceremony, Dad sat me down at this same kitchen table and explained that they couldn't cover the remaining tuition costs, But maybe I could take a gap year and work while they got their finances sorted out. That gap year stretched into 2 years, then 3, and by the time I finally enrolled as a part-time student, most of my scholarship opportunities had expired, and I was working 40 hours a week at Target just to pay for my classes. There was always something urgent that required my immediate sacrifice. Always a reason why my plans had to be put on hold, why my savings account had to be emptied, why my future had to wait while I fixed their present. And I'd always said yes, because that's what good daughters do, right? That's what family means. Showing up when people need you, no matter what it costs you personally. But sitting in Sarah's living room, surrounded by the familiar smell of her vanilla candles and listening to the steady hum of her air conditioning unit, I started to wonder if there was a difference between being needed and being used. I started to question whether love was supposed to feel this much like obligation. My phone buzzed again. Same unknown number. Don't go home tonight. Stay somewhere safe. The words made my hands shake as I read them. This person wasn't just warning me about tonight. They somehow knew my family well enough to predict exactly what they would do next, and they were actively trying to protect me from it. Reading that second message, I understood that the sender didn't just know my family very well. They were trying to protect me from something I hadn't even realized I needed protection from. I drove to Grandma and Grandpa's house on Maple Street the next morning, needing to understand the connection between those papers I'd glimpsed on Dad's desk and the growing certainty that my family was hiding something enormous from me. The familiar tree-lined neighborhood looked exactly the same as it had when I was little, and we'd visit every Sunday after church. The same red brick houses with their perfectly manicured lawns, the same American flags hanging from front porches, the same feeling of suburban stability that had always made this place feel like a safe harbor. But everything was wrong. Blazing lights filled every window of what should have been an empty house. A silver Honda Civic with Maryland plates sat in the driveway, where Grandpa's ancient Buick had lived for 30 years. Through the kitchen window, I could see a young couple unpacking boxes, a toddler running around with a sippy cup, the ordinary chaos of a family settling into their new home. Mrs. Patterson was deadheading her prize-winning roses when I approached her white picket fence, her gardening gloves stained with soil and her silver hair pinned back under a wide-brimmed sun hat. She looked surprised to see me, then concerned. "Oh, sweetie," she said in that gentle voice people use when they're about to deliver devastating news. "I assumed your parents had told you by now. The house sold about 2 weeks ago. Lovely young family from Baltimore. Seemed very eager to close quickly. The realtor said it was one of the fastest sales she'd ever handled." My chest felt like someone had wrapped steel cables around my ribs and pulled tight. I'd read Grandma's will so many times I could recite it word for word. The house would become legally mine when I turned 25, which was exactly 11 weeks from today. Until then, Mom and Dad were supposed to be temporary caretakers, maintaining the property but having no authority to make major decisions about it. Standing there breathing in the sweet scent of Mrs. Patterson's jasmine hedge, I finally understood why my parents had been acting like caged animals all weekend. This wasn't some spontaneous decision. This was a carefully orchestrated plan that had been months in the making. And I was apparently the only person who hadn't been informed about it. I thought about all those Sunday dinners at this very table, when Grandma would hold my hand and tell me stories about her childhood during the Great Depression, how she and Grandpa had saved every penny to buy this house in 1952. "This will be yours someday, honey," she'd always said, squeezing my fingers with her papery hands. "Take care of it the way we took care of you." I'd been the one who'd driven her to chemotherapy appointments when the cancer came back. I'd been the one who'd sat with Grandpa during his final weeks, reading him the sports section and making sure he took his medications. I'd been the one who'd earned this house through years of devotion and sacrifice, and my parents had sold it like it meant nothing at all. Recently, I'd noticed Dad taking phone calls and stepping out onto the back porch where he thought no one could hear him, but I'd dismissed it as work-related stress. Now I wondered what those conversations had really been about, and why he'd felt the need to hide them from his own family. Looking at that stranger's car parked where Grandpa's Buick used to sit, I realized there was a much bigger threat that even my parents were afraid of. I spent the rest of the morning parked across the street from my childhood home, watching my parents through the living room windows as they moved around, like people preparing for evacuation. Dad kept checking his watch and peering through the blinds. Mom was wrapping picture frames in newspaper with the frantic energy of someone racing against a deadline. Cardboard boxes and suitcases lined the hallway, and I could see them having intense, whispered conversations that stopped abruptly whenever one of them glanced toward the window. When they left around noon, Dad driving, Mom clutching a manila envelope against her chest like it contained state secrets, I used my spare key to slip inside. The house felt hollow and strange, like a movie set after the cameras stopped rolling. Family photos had been taken down from the walls, leaving behind lighter squares of paint. Important documents that usually lived in Dad's desk had vanished, though I found a few scattered papers in the kitchen trash that looked like they'd been torn up in a hurry. I called Mr. Henderson, the family lawyer who'd handled Grandma and Grandpa's estate, 17 times before he finally answered his phone at 2 in the afternoon. His voice sounded strained and tired when he picked up. "Thank God you called," he said before I could even identify myself. "I've been trying to figure out how to reach you safely." "Safely?" I asked, and the word hung in the air between us like a lead weight. "I was the one who sent you that text message last night," he admitted. "Your parents came to my office yesterday morning. They were acting very strangely, demanding that I sign certain documents that I felt were inappropriate. When I refused to cooperate, they became threatening." Mr. Henderson had been Grandma and Grandpa's trusted friend for over 20 years, had helped them draft their will, and had always treated our family with respect and kindness. The idea that my parents would threaten this gentle, elderly man made my stomach churn with a mixture of shame and fury. "I can't discuss the details over the phone," he continued, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "But the situation is more complex than you realize, and we need to meet in person immediately. Can you come to my office tonight, after hours, when we can talk privately?" The lawyer paused mid-sentence. "But there's something else you need to know about that conversation." And the look in his eyes told me that the worst part still hadn't been revealed. Mr. Henderson's law office felt different at 10 o'clock that night. The downtown streets were empty, except for the occasional taxi, and the building's night security guard had to escort me up to the 15th floor. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Mr. Henderson spread a thick manila folder across his mahogany conference table, documents that would change everything I thought I knew about my family. "Your parents owe $800,000, he said, his voice heavy with the weight of terrible knowledge. "It started small. Your father began gambling at the Riverboat Casino about 5 years ago. Just weekend trips with his construction buddies, nothing serious. But it escalated to sports betting, then online poker, then desperate attempts to win back what he'd already lost. He showed me printouts of betting accounts, loan documents with interest rates that made my hands shake, and email threats from debt collectors that used language I'd only heard in mob movies. 6 months ago, they came up with their plan," Mr. Henderson continued, pulling out a handwritten timeline that made my blood run cold. "They would sell your grandparents' house using the legal loophole that gave them temporary authority over the estate. They figured they'd take the money, disappear to a country without extradition treaties, and leave you to face the consequences when the creditors came looking for payment. The cruelty of it stole my breath. Under inheritance law, if my parents vanished and left behind massive debts, I would become legally responsible as their only child living at the family address. They weren't just abandoning me financially. They were literally feeding me to loan sharks who had already demonstrated their willingness to use violence. But when they came to my office demanding I falsify documents yesterday, I overheard your father on a phone call with one of the creditors." Mr. Henderson's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. He said, and I quote, "Tomorrow you can come to the house on Oakwood Drive. We won't be there anymore. Our daughter will handle everything from now on." The words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. "I have your contact information from your grandparents' estate files," he explained. "I sent that anonymous text because I couldn't bear to watch you walk unknowingly into this trap. If I'd contacted you directly, they would have known I'd betrayed their confidence and probably tried to leave town immediately." We spent the next 4 hours in that conference room, gathering evidence, documenting the fraud, and preparing a comprehensive report for the police. I signed my statement at 3 in the morning, my hand steady despite the magnitude of what I was doing. For the first time in my adult life, I was choosing to protect myself instead of automatically sacrificing for family, and it felt like finally learning how to breathe. My phone rang as I was leaving the police station. Dad's number. His voice was shaking when I answered, barely recognizable. "What have you done?" "The police called. They're saying we need to come in for questioning. How could you turn on your own family like this?" The call ended in silence, and I realized that the most terrifying thing wasn't that they would face consequences, it was that I felt absolutely no guilt about it whatsoever. I said, my voice steadier than I'd ever heard it. "You were planning to disappear tonight and leave me with $800,000 in debt to people who break legs for a living. How could you even ask me that question?" The silence stretched so long, I thought the call had dropped. When Mom took the phone, her voice was thick with tears. "Baby, we didn't have a choice. These people were threatening to hurt us, to hurt you if we didn't pay them back. We thought if we could just get enough money to satisfy them and start over somewhere safe, maybe we could send for you later, once the heat died down." "You had choices," I replied, surprised by the steel in my own voice. "You could have told me the truth 6 months ago when this started. You could have asked for help instead of planning to use me as a human shield. You could have gotten Dad into a treatment program instead of enabling his addiction and making me pay for it." I thought about all the times over the years when I'd been their safety net, their backup plan, their reliable daughter who would always sacrifice her own future to keep them comfortable, the graduation money I'd never seen again, the wedding fund that had mysteriously evaporated during their temporary financial difficulties, the countless weekends I'd spent working overtime to help cover their mortgage payments while my own dreams got smaller and smaller. "This time, I'm not going to save you," I continued, each word feeling like stepping stones across a river I'd been afraid to cross my entire life. "I'm done being the family member who fixes everyone else's mistakes while my own life falls apart. You had the chance to be honest with me from the beginning, but you chose to lie and manipulate and plan to abandon me until the very last second." The police worked with remarkable efficiency. At 6:15 the next morning, 2 patrol cars pulled up to my childhood home, just as my parents were loading their suitcases into Dad's pickup truck. I watched from Sarah's apartment window 3 blocks away as officers approached the front porch, knocked firmly on the red wooden door I'd painted with Dad when I was 16, and began the process that would unravel 5 years of deception. Instead of immediate arrests, the police brought my parents in for questioning and evidence gathering. The investigation took 6 months, during which Mom and Dad had to remain in state and couldn't access any money from the house sale. When it was over, the judge sentenced them to 2 years suspended sentence with mandatory participation in financial counseling and gambling addiction treatment, plus 200 hours of community service at a homeless shelter. The house sale was reversed, the fraudulent documents were voided, and I got back what had always been rightfully mine. But more importantly, I got back something I'd lost years ago without realizing it: my sense of self-worth. Throwing their letter into the trash without reading it, I wondered how many other family secrets were still buried, waiting to be discovered, and whether I was ready to face all of them. I moved into Grandma and Grandpa's house that December, 2 weeks before my 25th birthday, and 6 months before my wedding to Michael. The place still smelled like Grandma's lavender soap and Grandpa's cherry pipe tobacco, and every room held memories of Sunday dinners and Christmas mornings when I'd still believed that family meant unconditional love and protection. The legal proceedings wrapped up the following spring. My parents completed their court-mandated programs with what appeared to be genuine commitment. Dad attended Gamblers Anonymous meetings 3 times a week, and Mom took financial responsibility classes that taught her how to create realistic budgets and recognize the warning signs of destructive spending patterns. I remembered exactly how it had all started to end. At 6:15 on that Tuesday morning, watching from Sarah's window, as police officers walked up my childhood front porch and knocked on the door, just like the anonymous text had predicted they would. I saw Mom answer in her bathrobe, Dad appear behind her in his pajamas and reading glasses, and the moment their faces changed when they realized their escape plan had been discovered. After 6 months of counseling, their letters started to sound different. Less focused on excuses and self-pity, more concerned with understanding how their choices had affected me. They wrote about the shame of addiction, the way debt had made them feel trapped and desperate, and how they'd convinced themselves that involving me was somehow protecting me, rather than destroying my future. I planned my wedding for the following June, using the compensation money the court had awarded me for emotional damages and lost opportunities. The ceremony took place in Grandma's rose garden, exactly as I'd always dreamed, with white chairs arranged under the old oak tree where Grandpa used to read me stories. Mom and Dad weren't there, but Mr. Henderson was, along with Sarah and Michael and all the people who had supported me through the hardest year of my life. Mr. Henderson had become more than just the family lawyer. He was the person who had saved my life with a single text message, who had risked his own safety to protect mine. He told me later that the hardest part hadn't been deciding to warn me, but living with the knowledge of what my own parents had been planning to do to their child. A year after everything happened, when my parents had completed their rehabilitation programs and demonstrated genuine change, I made the decision to meet with them for coffee at a neutral location, not to forgive everything immediately, but to see if the people who had written those thoughtful, accountable letters were the same people who had once planned to sacrifice me to save themselves. I learned that sometimes loving someone means letting them face the consequences of their actions so they have a real opportunity to change, rather than enabling their worst behaviors and keeping them trapped in cycles of destruction. Some relationships require time and proof of genuine change before trust can be rebuilt, and this time, I would rebuild it on my own terms, in my own time, if I chose to rebuild it at all. When family members make serious mistakes that hurt you deeply, do you think it's better to impose harsh punishment so they learn their lesson, or to give them the opportunity to learn and grow through constructive consequences that focus on rehabilitation rather than revenge? Share your thoughts in the comments and follow for more stories about learning to put yourself first when family puts you last.